Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we are finally finishing our series here on all of the magic item changes in the Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons & Dragons 2024. It's been a long road. We've had about 6 videos over the last month and a half to get this all done. These will all be available in a playlist down in the description below. That playlist is of course also available on my channel page where you can see some of my other playlists, or just look at other videos that I've done that aren't in a playlist if you're interested in that sort of thing. But real quick, if you are a new or returning viewer to this channel and you haven't hit that subscribe button yet and you like what you see here, please consider hitting that subscribe button either now or at some point during this video. In our last video, we covered a lot of the things like I think we finished off the necklaces or the rings, and then we did like rods, robes, a lot of the R things. We started on the staves as well. We're getting into a lot of the big kind of groups of items. We left off with the staves, so without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started with it. Starting off strong with the Staff of Power. So the Staff of Power, the one thing that it mentioned here, and it said this in 2014 as well, it says it can be wielded as a magic quarterstaff. And it is worth pointing out, I don't even know if I mentioned it in the last video, because I know we mentioned staves in the last video as well. All staves, whether it's an actual quarterstaff or it's the arcane focus staff, which kind of all these are essentially, they can all be used as a magic quarterstaff. It was that way in 2014 per the player's handbook. It's also that way in 2024 per the player's handbook. So this means that all of these staves that we're going to look at effectively come with the topple mastery. Of course, you need to have the actual mastery feature and have the quarterstaff chosen as your weapon for that mastery in order to use that effect. But specifically for these staves that get a +2 bonus to the attack rolls when you're using them as a weapon, it is going to call them out that you can use them as a magic quarterstaff. Just wanted to point out as a basic statement, all staves are quarterstaffs. In addition to that, another common change that we've seen on magic items, including a lot of staves, robes, or wondrous items, or rods, rings, things that let you cast spells now. Many of them just say you can cast one of the spells from this item. Previously in 2014, it said that you can use an action to cast one of these spells. The sort of difference in syntax here is that when it said you can use an action to cast one of these spells, it basically meant that you needed to activate the magic item to use an action to cast that spell. With that text being removed, this basically means that you can still cast the spells from these items. However, they do now inherit the actual casting time of that spell. This doesn't matter for the spells listed on the Staff of Power here. They are all one action to cast. But we have seen in some of my previous videos that magic items contain spells that now have been updated to be a bonus action, or just now contain spells that were once usable as an action, but now since that is removed, you have to use the full casting time, which can be like an hour or even 8 hours. And I think we'll see more examples of that in this video. Another possible consequence of the fact that you are just now able to cast these spells using their innate casting time is that if you are a sorcerer, you could possibly quicken a spell from a magic item since you are using their natural casting time instead of using the magic item as an action to cast it. For the second half of the Staff of Power, it is now a magic action to break the staff from an action to make it explode, essentially. The explosion of the staff is considered an emanation from you. Previously, this was just a sphere centered on you. There's no mechanical change. They're just updating the emanation keywording. Creatures other than the wielder or the person who broke the staff and who failed to save against that explosion now take only 4 times the number of charges in the staff. Previously, there was a variable multiplier on that based on how close you were to the center of that explosion. Creatures who were closer took more damage and those who were further away took less damage. Notably, the 4 times the amount of charges is the least amount of damage based on that old table, but it is now just kind of easier to adjudicate. Finally, there is some text that was removed from the 2014 Staff of Power, where when you use it as a weapon to make a melee strike with it, you can expend a charge to deal an extra 1d force damage on hit. That feature is no longer present in the staff. Moving on to the Staff of Striking, much like the last staff, this can now be used as a quarterstaff, so it would have the topple mastery along with it. But of course, you do need to have the requisite mastery feature in order to use that mastery. For the Staff of Swarming Insects, it is now a magic action to create the insect cloud from an action. The cloud is considered an emanation, whereas previously this was a sphere. Again, no mechanical change. It used to say that a strong wind with a minimum speed of 10 miles per hour was required to disperse the swarm and end the effect, but now they just refer to like the Gust of Wind spell. And notably, I think the Gust of Wind spell also no longer mentions like a certain mile per hour or anything like that. I don't know how much more confusing that's going to be to adjudicate now when things like that come up, because there's multiple different kinds of effects, including some spells that also work similarly to this. Is it any wind from a spell of that level or higher, or like how does that work? Not quite sure. And again, like I mentioned in the Staff of Power, it now says that you can cast one of the spells, whereas previously it said you could use an action to cast one of the spells. But again, both of these spells in this item both require one action to cast. For the Staff of the Adder, this no longer requires attunement by a cleric, druid, or warlock, so anyone can attune to the staff. It is only a bonus action to animate or deanimate this from a bonus action with a command word. It now states that you can make a special attack with this weapon in place of one of your attacks during the attack action. Previously it just said that you can make a melee attack with it against a creature within 5 feet, and then it would deal extra damage. It wasn't clear if you could do that like on each attack, or if it was just like a special attack that you had to do as its own action. Like it didn't even mention that whether or not it was an action or not to do it. But now they have much more specific specific wording around the timing of it. So you can basically only use this once per turn and only on your turn because you have to do it during the attack action. So depending on how you would have ruled that timing previously, this could either be a nerf or a buff. Speaking of buffs, you can now also add your wisdom modifier to the attack roll, whereas previously this was only proficiency. Here you can add both proficiency and your wisdom modifier. Notably, it doesn't say your wisdom modifier in place of your strength modifier, so you are still adding your strength modifier to the attack roll. So if it's negative, you're kind of trying to overcome that with your wisdom. If you have a positive strength and positive wisdom, then you're getting the best of both worlds. I think if you're also using Shillelagh on this staff, then you could double dip on your wisdom modifier. I would have to double check the rules on that, but that might be a thing that you can do because Shillelagh lets you use wisdom instead of strength, and this adds your wisdom again. And I don't know that there's any rule that says you can't add your modifier twice to the same roll. I know it says that about proficiency bonus, but I don't think that applies to your ability modifiers necessarily. Additionally, the weapon now automatically deals an additional 3d6 poison damage on hit. Previously, the creature had to make a Constitution saving throw in order to take that damage. Moving on to the Staff of the Magi, this one has 3 parts. The only change in the first part here is that it is a quarterstaff, so it could have the topple mastery, assuming that you have the mastery feature for it. And then much like all the other staves that we're seeing that can cast spells, again, you don't need to use an action to activate the staff to cast those spells. You just use the normal casting time of those spells. All of these spells require an action to cast anyway, so there's no real change for this item for you. And then much like with the Staff of Power, we saw that it is a magic action to break the staff to cause it to explode. And again, the shape of that explosion is an emanation now, whereas previously it was a sphere centered on you. No actual change, it is just the wording that has changed. But unlike the Staff of Power, creatures who fail that explosion, other than the wielder, take damage equal to 6 times the number of charges in the staff, which was the second highest amount based on the previous wording in 2014. Moving on to the Staff of the Python, this no longer requires attunement by a cleric, druid, or warlock. It is now a magic action to activate from an action with a command word. The giant constrictor snake now shares your initiative but takes its turn immediately after yours. Previously, this had its own initiative. If you don't issue any commands to the snake, it will at least defend itself, whereas previously that was not part of the description. Then once you activate this item and have deactivated it, you have to wait an hour before you can use it again. Moving on to the Staff of the Woodlands, this one is a 2-parter. So again, much like the other staves, this one is a quarterstaff, so it would have the topple mastery, again, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. And again, like many other magic items, it is no longer an action to cast any of the spells from the staff. Notably, that is going to be important for the Awaken spell, because that now takes the full 8 hours to cast. Previously, you would have been able to do this as an action. And then the Bark Skin spell was buffed in 2024 to also be a bonus action. A small nerf here is that the Pass Without Trace spell now requires charges to cast, whereas previously in 2014, this one was free to cast from this item. So it seems that Wizards of the Coast has kind of wised up to like how powerful that spell is. Letting someone cast it at will is kind of maybe too strong. For the second half of this item, it is a magic action to plant or revert the tree form of this staff, whereas previously this was just an action. And again, there's another small nerf here where the staff regains 1d6 expended charges daily at dawn, down from 1d6 plus 4. Moving on to the Staff of Thunder and Lightning. So again, like every other staff, it is a quarterstaff, so it has a topple mastery, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. Both the Lightning and Thunder properties now specify that they don't require an action to use. I don't know who was requiring any sort of action to use these features, but it now specifies that they don't. The Thunder and Lightning property, that's the third feature here, now requires only a bonus action to use, whereas previously this was an action. The Lightning Strike is a magic action from an action, and the Thunderclap is now a magic action from an action, and it is now referred to as an emanation. But again, there's no mechanical change. It still works as far as the area that it takes up the exact same way. Moving on to the Staff of Withering, this no longer requires attunement by a cleric, druid, or warlock. Again, the magic items in D&D Beyond aren't fully accurate all of the time, so that's why I crossed it out here. In the actual book, it just says it requires attunement. And then, of course, like all of the staves, it is considered a quarterstaff, so it would have the topple mastery, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. For the Stone of Controlling Earth Elementals, this is now a magic action to activate from an action. And this is very similar to like the Censor of controlling fire elementals or whatever the other ones were. Previously, these kind of things used to summon the elemental as if you had cast Conjure Elemental. Now they just summon an elemental of that kind, and it now specifies all the rules about how that elemental works. Usually very similar to how they worked before for that spell. But now that that spell has been changed in 2024, these work more independently based on the description of the magic item. For the Stone of Good Luck, or the Luck Stone, this one is unchanged. For the Sunblade, this one is now a magic action to expand or contract the light radius from the magic item. Previously, this was just an action. And because it is specifically a longsword, this means that it has the Sap Mastery, again, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. For the Sword of Answering, it no longer requires attunement from a creature with the same alignment associated with the sword. This also no longer describes any of the Greyhawk setting specific lore that describes that there are 9 of these swords in existence, 1 for each alignment type. And of course, because it is a long sword, it again has the sap mastery provided that you have the requisite mastery feature for long swords. It is a little surprising that they removed the Greyhawk specific lore, considering that Greyhawk was the setting that was released in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 2024, or re-released, I should say. But technically, we're not losing any sort of mechanical benefits. Is more just like flavor. Moving on to one of the 4 artifacts in this video, we have the Sword of Kos. One change here is that this is now classified as a weapon, specifically a longsword. Previously, this was considered a wondrous item. Next, again, it says that you can cast one of the following spells from it, whereas previously this said you could use an action to cast one of the spells from this item. And again, I believe all of these spells require an action to cast, so there's no real change here. For the Battle Hunger feature, it says you can now add 1d10 to your initiative rolls, where previously this just said that you can add 1d10 to your initiative at the start of combat. This may only be important if your DM is using initiative scores to determine the order of combat, because sort of rules as written, at least, the initiative score for players is only 10 plus their dexterity modifier. There's nothing that says that you could add any bonuses that would be added to your rolls to your initiative score. Again, that's not how I would rule it specifically, but that's just what it says on paper. So if your DM is ruling it that way, then that technically wouldn't help you in this case. Additionally, the Sword of Kos also grants you now resistance to necrotic damage. And one of the funniest things I noticed, and I'm pretty sure I covered sentient items before, and I guess I maybe didn't see it in those videos, or maybe I don't remember if I saw it or not. The sentient items can no longer read. It used to say that they can speak, understand, and read in whatever language that they know, but now it just says that they speak those languages. And again, most of these things have dark vision out to a certain distance, so that means that they can see around them to a certain extent, but I guess they just can't read anymore, which is kind of funny. And then, of course, because this is a longsword, that means it has the sap mastery, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. Moving on to the Sword of Lifestealing, this can now be a glaive, greatsword, longsword, rapier, scimitar, or short sword. Previously, this was just any sword, and because it can be all of those weapons, that means it will have the associated mastery property of whatever weapon that is, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. This now deals 15 necrotic damage on a natural 20 from just 10, and it now grants temporary hit points equal to the necrotic damage taken from just a flat temporary hit points. So if they have resistance to necrotic damage, then you would only gain like 7. I would also say that it doesn't say the amount of necrotic damage taken from this effect, so if you have other necrotic damage riders, such as one of those, it's not Spirit Guardians, it's one of those spells that you can cast that adds necrotic damage or radiant damage to your strikes. Like if you're doing that and you crit with this weapon, then I would say that you also get the temporary hit points based on that necrotic damage in addition to the 15 from this item. For the Sword of Sharpness, this one now can be a glaive, greatsword, longsword, or a scimitar, whereas previously this was any sword that deals slashing damage. And of course, it has the associated mastery property of those weapons, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. This now gives the creature 1 exhaustion level on a natural 20, whereas previously this had the ability to remove limbs, but it doesn't do that anymore. And this now also no longer has the ability to shed light. For the Sword of Vengeance, this one can be a glaive, greatsword, longsword, rapier, scimitar, or short sword. Then much like every other weapon, again, it has the associated mastery of that weapon, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. For the Sword of Wounding, this can be any glaive, greatsword, longsword, rapier, scimitar, or short sword from any sword previously. Again, D&D Beyond's descriptions are a little wonky, and as a result, it has the associated masteries of those weapons, provided you have the requisite mastery feature. This one has basically been completely rewritten. It says when you hit a creature with an attack using this magic weapon, the target takes an extra 2d6 necrotic damage and must succeed on a DC 15 Constitution saving throw, or be unable to regain hit points for 1 hour. The target repeats the save at the end of each of its turns, ending the effect on itself on a success. I'm a little surprised by this weapon and another one that we'll see by the end of this video. They're basically kind of strictly better versions of the Flame Tongue weapon. Again, the Flame Tongue weapon, you have to have a bonus action to actually ignite it, and if you stow it or drop it or do anything along those lines, the fire goes out, and then you have to use your bonus action again to reignite it. And this one just deals 2d6 damage all the time. The other sword that we'll see later deals 2d6 damage all the time. It's a more reliable damage type. You know, necrotic damage has half the amount of resistances in the new Master Manual than fire does. Fire does technically have more vulnerabilities. There's 9 total creatures who are vulnerable to fire damage in the new Monster Manual. There are some creatures like the trolls, of course, whose regeneration can be shut off by fire damage. So there might be more instances where fire is specifically more useful, but in every other circumstance, this one is just strictly better from a damage perspective. Moving on to the Sylvan Talon, this is a new item in the Dungeon Master's Guide in 2024. It is a common weapon of these types that you can see here, and of course they have the associated mastery properties as is outlined in the table. The only sort of magic feature of this item is that you can understand the non-written communication of Fey creatures, so you can understand what they speak or sign, and then you can also use a magic action to cast the message cantrip once per long rest. For the Talisman of Pure Good, this requires attunement by a cleric or paladin, whereas previously this was any creature of good alignment, so it is now class specific. Fiends and undead specifically are damaged when handling the talisman, whereas previously this was any non-good aligned creature. Creatures of neither good nor evil alignment are also no longer damaged while handling the talisman, so they can kind of transport it or at least hold onto it now without taking any damage. Using the talisman as a holy symbol no longer requires the creature to be good aligned. The Pure Rebuke feature is a magic action from an action. The target creature no longer needs to be evil aligned to be affected by the feature. Fiends and undead specifically have disadvantage on the saving throw, whereas previously that was not part of the description. And then even if the creature succeeds on the saving throw, they still take 46 psychic damage, whereas previously, again, that was not part of the description. For the Talisman of the Sphere, this now grants advantage on intelligence arcana checks made to control the Sphere of Annihilation. Previously, this gave you expertise in that check. Expertise is a lot easier to come by, whereas advantage in an intelligence check is maybe a little bit harder, so that's probably a buff overall. And it also specifies that the extra movement granted to the sphere by this item doesn't need to be done in a straight line. Previously, that was not part of the description. For the Talisman of Ultimate Evil, it no longer requires the attunement by a creature of evil alignment. All non-fiends and non-undead take damage while handling the talisman. Previously, this was any non-evil aligned creature. Anyone can use it as a holy symbol, whereas previously this was only evil aligned clerics and paladins. And then the Ultimate End feature is a magic action to activate from an action. The target no longer needs to be a good aligned creature to be affected by it. Celestials, however, do have disadvantage on the saving throw, whereas previously that was not in the description. And again, much like the Talisman of the good one, even if the creature succeeds on the saving throw, they still take 46 psychic damage. Moving on to the Talking Doll. This was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, but it is unchanged. Similarly, the Tankard of Sobriety was also added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything and is also unchanged. The Tentacle Rod, this is now a magic action to use from an action, and now deals psychic damage on hit from bludgeoning damage. The saving throw, if you try to restrain one creature using all three tentacles, is now a dexterity saving throw, whereas previously this was constitution, and now just restrains the creature, whereas previously this halved their speed, gave them disadvantage on dexterity saving throws, removed their reactions, and made them choose between taking an action or a bonus action on their turn, but not both. The restrained condition now lasts until you're incapacitated. Use a bonus action to release them, or if they're no longer within 15 feet of you. Previously, this was a 1-minute duration. Additionally, the restrained creature continues to take 3d6 psychic damage at the start of each of their turns. Previously, this was not part of the description. We have the Thunderous Great Club. This is a new item to the Dungeon Master's Guide in 2024. This is supposed to be Bobby the Barbarian's club from the old D&D cartoon. The main highlights of this item is that it sets your strength to 20 if it is less, and it also deals extra thunder damage on hit. You can attempt to knock creatures in an area prone as a magic action using the Clap of Thunder feature, and then it also basically gives you the ability to cast the Earthquake spell once per long rest using the Earthquake feature, and then of course it has the Push Mastery, provided that you have the requisite Mastery feature. Moving on to the Tome of Clear Thought. And again, we saw similar changes to the manuals, the books for these the physical stats before. These now specify that the ability increases to a maximum of 30. Previously, this said that your ability score increases by 2, as does its maximum. And then, of course, I'll reiterate here that this was technically always the case, both in 2014 and 2024, because the rules in the Player's Handbook state that 30 is the maximum that an ability score can be. So even if you have an ability score of 30, an ability score of 31 or higher just doesn't exist in the game of D&D. So then moving on to the Tome of Leadership and Influence, it has the same exact change. For the Tome of Stilled Tongue, this one is unchanged. I kind of don't understand why this one is legendary, because the only thing it really allows you to do is once per long rest, you can cast a spell as a bonus action that is written in the tome without expending a spell slot or using any verbal or somatic components. You know, at high levels, this is basically an extra 9th level spell, and maybe that's worth being legendary. But I just think it's kind of funny and also kind of cool at the same time that you could give this to a level 1 wizard. And assuming that there are no high level spells already written in the spellbook, then you can give a level 1 wizard this item, and it's perfectly fine. Like it's not going to break your game at all. For the Tome of Understanding, much like the other tomes that we saw, they have the same change where it has a maximum of 30. For the Trident of Fish command, this no longer requires an action to cast the spell from this item, but again, Dominate Beast has a casting time of 1 action, so there's effectively no change. It also now states that you can cast this against any beast that has a swim speed. Previously in 2014, this said any beast with an innate swim speed. And of course, because it is a trident, it also has the Topple Mastery, provided that you have the requisite Mastery feature. So the only real change between an innate swimming speed and a swim speed means that, like, if someone cast Water Walking on a T-Rex, that gives them a swim speed, and then you'd be able to cast Dominate Beast on them, even though they are not naturally an aquatic creature. They don't innately have a swim speed, but now you can do that in those circumstances. For the Universal Solvent, this now contains 1d6 plus 1 ounces of liquid when found. Previously, there was no description on how much this contains, and it is now a utilize action to pour 1 ounce of solvent out, whereas previously this was an action. The Veteran's Cane was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. It is a bonus action to transform the cane back and forth, whereas previously this was a bonus action with a command word. And because it is a longsword, it would have the Sap Mastery, provided that you had the requisite mastery feature. Moving on, we have the Vicious Weapon. These now deal an extra 2d6 damage of the weapon's type on each hit, whereas previously this was only 7 damage on critical hits. And of course, because it is a weapon, it would naturally have the mastery property of whichever weapon that you're using, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. But this is the other weapon in addition to the Sword of Wounding or whatever it was that dealt the 2d6 necrotic damage on each hit, that I think is basically just kind of strictly better than the Flame Tongue, especially now that we have the new monster manual. And we can see that resistance and immunity to bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing is basically almost completely gone. It's only really swarms, ghosts, and maybe some slimes or oozes have resistance to all 3 of them. But outside of that, this is basically, again, just strictly better than the Flame Tongue in the vast majority of situations. And again, the only real reason that this is the case is because the Flame Tongue requires a bonus action to ignite the weapon, whereas the Sword of Wounding and the Vicious Weapons are just active all the time. And there are a lot of good bonus actions in the game these days. So trying to micromanage sort of keeping your Flame Tongue activated when you need it isn't always easy. It's very easy to be caught, without it lit. And then you have other things to do as your bonus action, like if you're a barbarian, you want to rage first before you ignite it. So because these other weapons exist and because they're all rare weapons, I don't see any reason to require the Flame Tongue to require a bonus action anymore. I would just say that it ignites as soon as you draw the weapon. I mean, I would say that's perfectly fine. Moving on to the Vorpal Sword, this one can now be a glaive, greatsword, longsword, or scimitar, whereas previously this was any sword that deals slashing damage. And because these are weapons, of course, they have the associated mastery property of that weapon, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. This now deals a flat 30 extra slashing damage to creatures who don't or can't have their head cut off. Previously, this was 68 damage, which is a 27 on average. Notably, legendary creatures are now susceptible to the effect, but it does say that they can use a legendary resistance to avoid having their head cut off. I think that's actually a pretty cool change, because if you happen to have a Vorpal Sword and you're fighting legendary creatures, that is basically guaranteeing that you can burn one of the legendary resistances whenever you roll a natural 20. It might not happen all the time, but when it happens, it's going to feel good. Moving on to the Walloping Ammunition. This one is added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. This one is also unchanged. The Wand of Binding no longer requires attunement by a spellcaster. It no longer requires an action to cast one of the spells from the item, but again, both of the spells on this item both require one action to cast. And they also removed one of the features called Assisted Escape, so that is no longer part of this item anymore. For the Wand of Conducting, this was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. It's a magic action to activate from an action, and the sound is audible now to 120 feet, whereas previously this was only 60 feet. For the Wand of Enemy Detection, this one does still require attunement. It doesn't list it that way on D&D Beyond. I've read in some of the comments on the actual item pages that if you look it up in the source, like if you go into the actual Dungeon Master's Guide on D&D Beyond, all the magic items are listed appropriately. It's just sort of like in the database part of it that these are listed weirdly. Additionally, this one is now a magic action to activate from an action. Similarly, the Wand of Fear also still requires attunement. It's just not listed that way in D&D Beyond. And again, like many other items, this no longer requires an action to cast one of these spells from this item, but both of these spells do require an action to cast. This item also now casts the actual Fear spell. Previously, this was an effect that worked similarly to the Fear spell, but not exactly. But this is basically the Fear spell, but it's been buffed to a 60-foot cone from a 30-foot cone. Likewise, it also now costs 3 charges to cast from only 2. And then a buff that isn't listed here is that the actual Fear spell also causes creatures who fail their saving throw to immediately drop what they're holding. Previously, that was not part of the original effect on this item in 2014. For the Wand of Fireballs, it is no longer an action to cast Fireball from this item, but again, Fireball still has a casting time of 1 action. Additionally, they put a limit on how many charges you can expend at one time to cast Fireball, so you can't spend more than 3 charges, whereas previously there was no limit other than the number of charges you had left. This means that the highest level of Fireball you can cast from this item is a 5th level Fireball, down from a 9th level Fireball. Likewise, we have the Wand of Lightning Bolts, which is basically the exact same item, but for Lightning Bolt. So again, it doesn't require an action to cast from this item, but the spell itself still requires an action. Likewise, you can only spend 3 charges per cast, making the highest level Lightning Bolt a 5th level Lightning Bolt, down from 9th level. For the Wand of Magic Detection, again, it doesn't require an action to activate this item to cast this spell, but Detect Magic is still a spell that requires an action to cast. For the Wand of Magic Missiles, again, very similarly, it doesn't require an action to cast it from this item, but Magic Missile still has a casting time of 1 action. And then again, much like the Wand of Fireballs and the Wand of Lightning Bolts, you can't spend more than 3 charges per cast, whereas previously there was no limit. This means that the highest spell level of Magic Missile that you can cast is level 3, down from level 7. I think the intentions of the nerfs to these weapons is to prevent players from casting a higher level spell than they would normally be able to cast when they might normally find this weapon. For example, if you're in a tier of play where uncommon magic items are still very desirable, you're probably not at a level where you can cast spells that are 4th level or higher. They wanted to limit it so that like a level 3 character finds a wand of magic missiles and then casts a 7th level spell, you know, against a CR5 creature or whatever. So that is a little unfortunate, and I was able to use the wand of magic missiles in our last 2014 rule campaign, at least to great effect. I happened to pick it up, and then I realized that I was also playing a Hexblade, so I had the combination of magic missiles plus Hexblade's curse to add the extra proficiency bonus damage to each missile. And then I was also playing the old Aasimar, where you get the damage equal to your level once per turn, and we were level 12 at the time, and I rolled a 4 on my magic missile, so it's 9 damage per missile for 9 missiles for 81 damage from that, plus 12 damage from the Aasimar effect for a total of 93 unavoidable damage, so that was kind of funny. But moving on to the Wand of Orcus, this one now says that all holy water within 10 feet of the wand is destroyed. Previously it said things like plants wither around it, drinks spoil, flesh rots, and vermin thrive, but now it's just all holy water within 10 feet is destroyed. Additionally, any creature who fails the saving throw to attune to this item is turned into a zombie only if they're humanoid, whereas previously this was any creature. Debatably, this one also has the sap mastery because it says you can wield this wand as a magic mace. Your DM might disagree since it still qualifies as a wand, but if you are allowed to do it, then of course you would need to have the requisite mastery feature for maces to use it. Much like the other magic items, it no longer requires an action to cast one of these spells to activate the item to use it. That is only important for Animate Dead, so Animate Dead is now going to require a whole minute to cast. All of the other spells require an action. The Call Undead effect is now a magic action from an action, and Call Undead now summons 15 skeletons and 15 zombies, whereas previously this was a number of skeletons and zombies whose average health adds up to 500 or less. So you could kind of determine how many of each that you wanted. So according to the legacy stat blocks for zombies and skeletons, you could have up to 22 zombies or up to 38 skeletons, or if you kind of wanted to split it, you could do 11 zombies and 19 skeletons, for example. So based on the old stat blocks, 30 monsters is kind of a fair compromise and kind of prevents tables from having to figure out how much of each thing to do just in the moment. However, notably, zombies in 2024 have fewer hit points, so by those stat blocks, you're actually getting less than you would normally do, but that's just sort of the price of convenience. And then much like the Sword of Cost, the Wand of Orcus also can no longer read, so that's a little unfortunate. Moving on to the Wand of Paralysis, this is a magic action to activate from an action. For the Wand of Polymorph, this one again no longer requires an action to activate, but Polymorph still has a casting time of 1 action. For the Wand of Pyrotechnics, this was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. It is a magic action to activate from an action, and the effects are visible from 120 feet away, up from 60. The Wand of Secrets is a magic action to activate from an action. The Wand of the War Mage is unchanged. The Wand of Web no longer requires an action to cast from this item, but again, Web still has a casting time of 1 action. For the Wand of Wonder, this one's kind of a long one. So this one no longer requires attunement by a spellcaster. It is a magic action to activate from an action. It now targets a point within 120 feet, whereas previously it could be a point, creature, or object. So it is now specifically just a point you choose within 120 feet. And then moving on to the actual effects of it. So you'll roll a d100 and you get results based on this table. So the 1 through 20 results, these spells all used to have their own results at 4% chance each. Notably, the odds of any of these effects still occurring is about 4% because it's 20% of 20. For the result of 26 through 30 for the Gust of Wind, the line created by this effect now extends from you to the point of origin. And the point of origin is the point that you chose when you used the item. The result of 31 through 35, it no longer attempts to cast Detect Thoughts. It just deals psychic damage to you. For the result of 36 through 40, the duration, dimension, and shape were added, and the odds were increased from 5% to 3%. For 41 through 45, dimensions and shape were added. Odds were increased from 5% to 3%. And then for the 46 through 50, the line extends from you to the point of origin, and the odds were reduced to 5% from 10%. And then I actually didn't fit it on the screen here, but for 51 through 55, the creature closest to the point of origin becomes the target of that effect. Previously, that was not part of the description. For 56 through 60, the creature disappears after 1 hour or after it's reduced to 0 hit points. Previously, this was not part of the description. You also roll 1d4 to determine the animal from 1d100. The odds were increased to 5% from 3%. For the 65 through 68, this now specifies that nothing happens if there are no legal targets. Previously, that was not part of the description. Odds are increased to 4% from 3%. And the result of 73 through 77, the odds also here were increased to 4% from 3%. For the result of 78 through 82, this area is now considered an emanation, but there's no mechanical change. For the result of 88 through 92, the odds were increased to 5% from 3%. The result of 93 through 97 is a whole new effect, so it says you cast Polymorph, targeting the creature closest to the point of origin. Roll 1d4 to determine the target's new form. On a 1, it's a black bear. On a 2, it's a giant wasp. On a 3 to 4, it's a frog. And then the result of 98 through 100, the affected creature is no longer instantly petrified if they fail to save by 5 or more. And there's only one effect that was removed, and that is the skin turning bright blue for 1d10 days. Moving on to Wave, this one no longer requires attunement by a creature that worships the god of the sea. It only triggers the extra damage on a natural 20, whereas previously this was any critical hit. That extra damage now only equals 21 necrotic damage, whereas previously this was half the creature's maximum hit points. Previously, this magic item also had the effects of a number of different magic items. So the Combat Ready feature takes the place of the Weapon of Warning magic item. This means that it only grants advantage on your initiative rolls. This benefit no longer extends to your allies. The Underwater adaptation replaces the Cap of Water breathing effect. The Aquatic Command replaces the Trident of Fish command effect. The Globe of Invulnerability replaces the Cube of Force effect. Much like the other sentient items, Wave can also now no longer read, nor does it communicate with aquatic creatures. Wave also now has an entry about how it can be destroyed, and of course, because it is a trident, that means it also has the Topple Mastery, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. Moving on to the Weapon of Warning, this now has the mastery property of whichever weapon it is, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. Similarly, the +1, 2, and 3 weapons again have the mastery property of whichever weapon it is. For the Well of Worlds, this is now a magic action to unfold or fold the item from an action. Moving on to Whelm, this can now also be attuned to by a creature who is attuned to the Belt of Dwarven Kind. Previously, this could only be attuned to by dwarves. When throwing this weapon, it now has a minimum and long range of 60 and 180. This is up from 20 and 60. When throwing this item, it also now deals force damage from bludgeoning damage. It also now deals an additional 48 damage to constructs, elementals, and giants when thrown. Previously, this was only 2d8 damage and only to giants. The Shockwave effect is now a magic action from an action, and the DC is 20 rather than 15. And again, it no longer requires an action to cast the spells from this item, but the spells that you cast from this item both require an action to cast anyway. Then, like every other sentient weapon, this one can also now no longer read. It also no longer shouts dwarven battle cries in combat. For the personality, and while the personality was kind of trimmed for all of these magic items, but most of the things that got trimmed in the other magic items didn't seem to be associated with like whatever its goal is, because it always says conflict arises if the wielder doesn't share this goal. So one thing that Whelm said previously that it doesn't say anymore is that it seeks to slaughter goblins and giants, and it also removes some history about how it was once used by a vampire dwarf to kill his own clan. So there's just kind of some history that's missing there, which is a little unfortunate. They did add a section about how to destroy the artifact, and then of course, because it is a Warhammer, that also means that it has the push mastery, provided that you have the requisite mastery feature. Moving on to the Wind Fan, this one no longer requires an action to cast the spell from the item, but again, the Gust of Wind spell has a casting time of 1 action. For the Winged Boots, this now has charges to use, whereas previously you could use this just for up to 4 hours total. We saw a similar change to, I think it was the Ring of Invisibility or the Cloak of Invisibility, one of those 2 items. It now recharges 1d4 uses daily at dawn. Previously you needed to stop using this for 12 consecutive hours to regain a total of 2 hours at a time. Now requires a magic action to activate, whereas previously this was sort of always active, but it was only consuming time if you were flying. Fly speed is also now set at 30 feet, whereas previously this was equal to your walking speed. And each time you use one of these charges, you gain that flight speed for 1 hour. Previously, when you were flying, you consumed the time in 1 minute increments. While the magic action to activate is a little annoying, this should ultimately result in you in having a little bit more flexibility with when and how often you use this on a day-to-day basis. You will probably have more time available over a long period of time, especially if you're doing back-to-back adventuring days with very little downtime. If you're really sort of into micromanaging your time with these sorts of items, you'll probably maybe feel a bit of a nerf, but overall, I don't think there'll be that big of a difference. Moving on to the Wings of Flying, this is now a magic action to activate or deactivate. Previously, this was an action with a command word, and it also now specifies that you will just fall if you are still in the air when the wings disappear. And then the final item for this entire series is the Wraps of Unarmed Power. This was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from the Book of Many Things. In the Book of Many Things, they were called the Wraps of Unarmed Prowess. So I guess if we're being really technical, then 2 very similar items both exist at the same time. The only real difference besides the name is that these ones can now deal force damage or their normal damage type of your unarmed strikes. Previously, they allowed your unarmed strikes to be considered magical for the purposes of overcoming resistance. But of course, they removed resistance to non-magical damage in 2024, so that's no longer really relevant. And that is it. That is all of the magic item changes in the Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide for 2024. I'm a little glad that we were able to kind of finish off strong with this one, because I felt like the last video didn't really contain a lot of exciting items, whereas this time we had a bunch of the swords, a lot of the good staves, we had 4 different artifacts in this one as well, a few different legendary items and everything. So a lot of good stuff in this one, I think. And again, I know these weren't my most popular videos, but that some of you in my comments have been letting me know that you really enjoyed these things. So of course, this is here for you. This is here for posterity, for anyone who is changing over from 2014 to 2024 and is just kind of interested in how magic items are changed or have been changed. Again, let me know down in the comments what your favorite change was in this video, or if there are any sort of cool combinations that exist now with any of these magic items that maybe I didn't mention or didn't think about. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new or returning viewer to this video and you haven't hit that subscribe button yet and you like what you saw here, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps me out quite a bit. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate all of your time, and I'll see you in the next one.